This is the second in the 8-part series on the 7 factors of enlightenment. Last time I went through an overview of the 7 factors of enlightenment, and I'll just briefly recap what was said there, and then in this session focus on the first factor, mindfulness, sati in Pali. So last time went through, just named the 7 factors, and then talked about different ways you can work with the 7 factors of enlightenment. Turns out, just as with any teachings or any practice, it's not just one way that it's understood, practice. It's not only one way that will work best for you. So I mentioned that one way to work with it is to work systematically, consciously, developing the 7 factors progressively through the steps. Another way is to think of it as a description of the unfolding that naturally happens, just by starting with mindfulness, the first factor. Another way that it can be thought of as 3 of the factors were energizing, 3 of the factors were more tranquilizing, and then the mindfulness was a balancing in the middle. And sometimes we will use different sets to balance out when that's needed. And then another way it's thought of is as a bare list of qualities that are all there in whatever way and in whatever combinations, if and when we need to think of it like that. And probably for most of us, if you're using this system, the 7 factors system, that it will, you want to have all these different approaches available, and with time and experience, you won't have to think about it. You'll just know how you're relating or working with it at any time. Last time I also said that to get an idea of how important the 7 factors are considered in Pali Buddhism, that in multiple places in the old texts, the Pali Suttas, it is said that anybody who's ever has, is now, or ever will in the future attain the ultimate goal of Dharma practice, enlightenment, liberation, whatever term you like. They use a particular phrase in the texts. You could say Nibbana in Pali, Nirvana in Sanskrit, however you like to think of it. Anyone who's ever done that or ever will has done it by cultivating and bringing the 7 factors of enlightenment to fruition. So that's a powerful statement of the level of emphasis and importance that Theravada Buddhism places on the 7 factors of enlightenment. I actually purposely, I just left part of that formulation out that I want to bring in now. What it really says is anyone who has attained this ultimate goal, there are actually 3 steps. The first is setting aside the hindrances, then cultivating what's called the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then followed by bringing the 7 factors to fruition. So let me just hang out a little bit with, I won't go in a lot of depth just because of time, but first on the hindrances, that would be a whole series of talks in and of itself. But it basically means, what's a hindrance? Well, it's anything that causes us trouble and difficulties, that sort of blocks or prevents or makes it harder to move forward in whatever we're doing. For meditation practice, there's a particular list of hindrances that's given, but it basically means qualities of our mind that can get us caught up. So one might be if our energy's too low. That's a hindrance, right? What if you're trying to meditate and you're falling asleep all the time? It's hard to meditate. Then you want to know that. Are there things we can do to help counter that? The opposite of having energy too low might be energy too high. We're too stirred up. We're too restless. And that restlessness can be in the body. It can be mental. So that's considered a hindrance. We don't have to put these hindrances aside forever, but can we find a way just for the period of time when we're going to meditate to help settle it out, set it aside enough so that we can be more present and work with it? That's the idea. A few more again, this isn't a complete list, but if we get caught up in aversion or the opposite of aversion, which is like craving after something, these it's hard for the mind to settle down, right? When we have this. So are there ways we can learn to let go around those? That's the idea of the hindrances. Once we've been able to set those aside enough, this cultivation of the four foundations of mindfulness, well, here we are talking about the first element or first factor of the seven factors. The four foundations is a particular formulation. There's one of the texts in the Pali Suttas. The name in Pali is, it's a long Pali name. You don't have to know it, but it's, for those who are interested, Satipatthana. There's that word sati, which is mindfulness. Generally gets translated as the foundations of mindfulness. And it's called four because it's broken into four groups. And it's a long sutta, I don't remember, but more than 10 pages, maybe more than a dozen pages, in a lot of detail about different ways to apply our mindful attention, different ways to work with mindfulness of the body. Mindfulness of breathing is an example, but there's many other experiences going on in the body. There's a lot of discussion about that. How to connect with, there's not only our experience, but we can be mindful of the fact that experiences are pleasant or unpleasant, or they use the word neutral. It's not really neutral, but that's shorthand for neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So we can start to be mindful of that quality that accompanies any experience. That can help unmask levels of clinging or reactivity perhaps we hadn't seen. So mindfulness of the body, of what they call feeling tone on this pleasant and unpleasant. It doesn't mean feelings in the sense of, in the meaning of emotions or moods. The third is around states of the mind and the heart, and it can know, for example, whether some of these reactive patterns are present in the mind. And then the fourth is mindful of, there's a lot in there about different teachings and different lists, and it's complicated, but like, for example, one of the lists is called the six senses or sense bases or sense doors, and it means as we're moving about, the senses, I'll just tell you quickly, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. They use the word touch for other body sensations. And then the sixth is called the mind door. It's not a sense in the way we normally think of the physical senses, but it's considered in this model a sense because it's another way that we have experience, mental experience. And you can be mindful of seeing and hearing and tasting and smelling, etc. And you can also be mindful if you're getting reactive depending on what you're experiencing. It's things like that. So obviously that was pretty quick just to give a rough idea, but just to know that it's considered the four foundations of mindfulness. Some people use that formulation as a complete style or manual or instructions for meditation, in the same way we're talking about the seven factors. And in fact, in a few places, actually more than a few places in the Pali texts, it's explicit that the goal of the four foundations of mindfulness is to bring the seven factors to fruition. So that is a particular then use of how we're using our mindfulness. And that's what I want to focus on for the rest of this discussion and this session. Because there's lots of ways to be mindful. We can just be mindful of what's happening in any situation, just in daily life. And that's important. We want to have that ability. I'll give you my definition of mindfulness. There's a lot of different definitions out there. My definition of just the state of being mindful is not being lost on automatic pilot. Sometimes when people get caught up in something, you'll hear someone say, oh, they lost their mindfulness. They went unconscious. And we know what they mean. It's perfectly fine to speak that way, but they're not actually unconscious. They just got caught up in what's happening. And just a quick example, if you're, for example, say you get angry and reactive to something, you're not unconscious, but you're just totally caught and lost in it. Um, that's very different than if you, we could say, kind of wake up in the midst of what's happening and just have the mindfulness that can just stop and say, oh, I'm angry. Depending on the strength of what's going on, the power of that anger, it might still pull us into it, but it gives us the opportunity now. We have some conscious choice on how we may choose to work with it when we actually are mindful about what's happening rather than just lost in it. So that's my definition, not being lost on automatic pilot. That's the state of being mindful. But there's the practice of mindfulness, how we use our mindful attention. So I think both of those come into play in the 7 factors. You want to have just being mindful, but a lot of it also because we want to work with it as a practice in service of deepening through the other factors. How can we use mindfulness to strengthen any of the other factors? So I said earlier that one way to work with this list is to just as a description of what happens when you just start with mindfulness. I use the example of mindfulness of breathing or whatever practice you're doing. We bring our attention to connect with that meditation object or practice, and we're directing our mindfulness right there, and then the rest can unfold on its own. As things are happening, we want to have mindfulness of what's happening through the other stages also, to let us know, do I need to bring in more balancing? I need to know what's happening. Do I need to bring in more investigation or discernment? Do I need to up the energy or help tranquilize more? So I have to mindfully know what's happening. But also we can direct this mindful attention as part of the mindfulness meditation practice into any of these others. So there's a way to work mindfully with strengthening the piti, the rapture. There's a way to work mindfully to strengthen the energy. So we can direct our mindful attention as we're progressing step by step through all the stages. When we talk about mindfulness strengthening and growing, what we really mean is even if you've never meditated and you don't feel like you have that clear of a mind necessarily, whatever level of mindfulness you have that's fine. That's all you need. But the level of clarity of our minds will it grow as the practice deepens. This comes out of the samadhi side, the concentration. When it deepens, we not only wander away less and less in our practice and get lost less and less, and we're more present, more calm. We just feel deeper in. We'll discuss more of that when we get to that session on samadhi. But the mind gets much clearer, and our perceptions grow a lot. The mindfulness, along with the second factor, the discernment, or you could say the investigation part, is clearer. So it's another way that then we can even use the more clear mind to even more deeply connect with what's happening, be aware of what's happening, and know what might be needed in any particular moment. So basically, the bottom line, simplicity, a simple way to work with all this is mindfulness is a practice, and then you'll see for yourself as it deepens and grows, you'll naturally be more mindfully aware. It'll be more obvious what's needed at each step. And we can also turn the mindfulness in other ways, not just on the original meditation object, even though you may stay with that, that could be your whole practice. But when we start working with the others objects also, the mindfulness can go in and work with those. So quite a range of ways we can bring mindfulness into the practice.